May He protect us. May He sustain us. May we grow in strength together. May our study together be fruitful. And may we not hate one another. Oh, peace, peace, peace. So, good morning and welcome to the service. Swami Vivekananda has been doing a series of talks on meditation, why we should meditate, theory and practice. Today he's up in Detroit, so I'll be doing the talk instead. And we also, this weekend, we have a retreat at Ganges with Swami Varadananda, so all that's going on. But I'll continue the topic he's been talking on. Now the question is, why should we meditate? Now there are, back in ancient times in India, the ancient rishis, they revealed a whole spiritual dimension, a whole spiritual reality of things. And they said that this spiritual reality, this infinite, immortal, eternal spiritual reality is actually within each person as their own inner consciousness. Now, as we mentioned before, that Swami Vivekananda, he said that we all exist as three beings simultaneously. We exist as a physical being, we exist as a mental being, and we exist as a spiritual being. But what we become in actual practice, in actual experience, depends on where we put our attention. Now, if our attention is focused primarily on the body, in what we experience through the body and through the senses, then our consciousness, it becomes physical. And our sense of identity, who we are, it becomes, okay, I'm this body. And then through this body, we get some pleasures, some pleasant things, and we also get some pains and some sufferings. And the realm of the mind and the spirit, they're just kind of in the background. Many people are hardly even aware that they have a mind. They're so focused on the physical level. But then there are some people, for example, scholars, artists, intellectuals, people like scientists, who go inward, become more introspective, become more aware of the realm of the mind. And as they do this, they discover a whole new realm opens up. Rather than just a purely physical existence of eating and sleeping and going through your daily routine, you now begin to discover that there's this whole vast area of knowledge, of learning, of understanding things, of inspiration, of beauty. And so the person who focuses attention on the mind and the intellect, for him, the body and the kind of physical sensations, they kind of recede into the background. And his inner mental activity, this becomes kind of the focus of his existence. And his sense of who he is or what he is becomes primarily mental. Because I am what I know, what I understand, what I experience inside through my mind. Now there's a third level where a person, as he goes deeper still, he begins to realize that the mind and the mental activities, the thoughts, the feelings, the different emotions and things that go through the mind, that all these things are taking place in mind, but that there's something else there that's aware of the mind. And it's at that point, then a person starts to become aware of the spiritual dimension. He starts to become aware of the presence of God that's there within him. Now, as Swamiji said, all three of these are simultaneously. At every moment, we have our body that we experience, we have our mind, we have our thought, our intellect, and also, at every moment, we have the presence of God within us. But what we actually experience depends on where we're putting our attention. So as the person begins to focus on the mind, he becomes more intellectual and opens up the whole vast area of the mind. A person who's purely physical is living primarily at the animal level, just going through experiencing physical sensations, heat and cold, and pleasure and pain and so forth. The person who has gone to the mental level, he's become actually a full human being. Because it's out of the mental level that all of human civilization has come. You know, if it wasn't for the mind and its riches and its vast discoveries, we would all be living as kind of primitive savages, not knowing anything more than just our daily life. But so, as a person becomes established in the mind, then this whole vast realm of mental discovery, of mental search for truth and so forth, out of which all of science and technology, all of civilization has come, that becomes prominent. And the person is truly human at that level. But then there's this deeper level which has been touched by the saints and the sages in all the religions, where they discover that in addition to my own mind, my personal mind, my thoughts, my understanding, my feelings, there's something else here, which is the vast, infinite, omniscient, omnipotent presence of God. And it's possible for a person to consciously experience that divine presence, to actually have that be a reality in his experience. And this is the real meaning of religion according to Vedanta, according to Hinduism. That there's a difference between religion and spirituality. A person can be religious. He can be a very good, ethical, moral person, lead a very good life, go to church or temple every Sunday, and like that, read scriptures, read holy books, things like that, and yet still be ordinary human being, good human being, and a happy human being, but still an ordinary human being. But when he begins to go within and become aware of the spiritual level of his being, then he begins to be transformed into something that's beyond human. He begins to be transformed into, or become aware of the fact that he's actually soul, he's actually spirit. See, right now we have body, we have mind, we have a spirit. The body and the mind, they're instruments. Those instruments are being used by the soul. The soul which took this birth to get certain experiences, a certain life, to go a certain development and knowledge. The body and mind, they're instruments that are being used by that soul for its own purposes. But the problem is that in the process of getting absorbed in body and mind, we forget the soul. We forget that it's there. We forget who we are. And this is where all of our sufferings, all of our limitations, all of our difficulties come from, is that we've cut ourselves off from that divine presence which knows what it's doing, which can do it, which is full of wisdom, full of love, full of goodness. We've cut ourselves off from that and then try to express ourselves just through the body and the mind. So the purpose of religion, according to Vedanta, is to have God become an actual experience. It's not enough just to say, yes, I believe in this, yes, I'm a good person, I'm a moral person. You actually have to reach the point where God's Spirit becomes an actual experience within your consciousness. And this is why people meditate. Like I said, you can be religious, you can be a very good person, you can do many good deeds and study scriptures and so forth without kind of going within. But if you want to know what God is, who you are, what the real purpose of your life is, then you have to begin to look within. Because these things you won't find outside. You know, God won't come walking up to you on the street. You have to look within. Look within your own inner consciousness, and there is where you'll discover His presence. And so in spiritual life, it's necessary to get that inner kind of experience of who you actually are. And then everything else will fall into place. And so this is the meaning of meditation. The basic principle behind meditation is that there are hundreds of different techniques available by which a person can meditate, but the purpose behind all of them, the ultimate goal, is to achieve a shift in consciousness. First of all, to shift your consciousness from the purely physical, dealing only with the external world, dealing only with what's happening outside, you gradually shift the consciousness within and become aware, first of all, of the mind, of the intellect. You become introspective and conscious of what's going on inside you. And then gradually you go deeper still and discover there's this spiritual, infinite spiritual presence of God within that brings, fulfills all your needs. You know, everybody in this world is searching for something. If you ask people, they say, well, basically, I want to be happy. I want to be peaceful. I want to be happy. You know, I want to be content. And most of the time, we're trying to find that happiness outside. We're thinking, this person will make me happy, or this, more money will make me happy, or fame will make me happy, or a better house will make me happy. Like that, we're looking outside and we're saying, if I can get this thing here, this will make me happy. If I can get that thing, then I'll be happier. And like that, we are searching. Practically everyone is searching. There's a sense that something's missing, that there's something lacking. I don't have something that I had. And so, but that search only succeeds when you realize that what you're seeking is not something outside yourself. It's not something in the external world. What you're actually seeking is something that's within. It's like the sun is shining brightly all the time, but there's clouds in front of the sun. So you live in gloom. You don't know that it's there. In the same way, in the spiritual life, you're trying to gradually remove the clouds that have resulted from your absorption at the physical level, the mental level. You're trying to remove the clouds so that the inner light that's within you, it can begin to come forth. And when it begins to come forth, then you find yourself completely fulfilled. And now you find, oh, this, what I've been seeking, this is what it is. This is it here. You may think, oh, you know, $1 million will make me happy, and you may get the $1 million and still be very miserable. But when you touch that inner self within, then you'll find that right away you say, oh, this is it. This is what I've been seeking. And so this is a basic principle in spiritual life, is that happiness is not something that you get, it's something that you are. Normally we say, I'm going to get this and then I'll be happy. But in fact, first learn how to be happy, and then you'll see every experience you have, everything you have, it becomes happy, it becomes joyous. And so this is what you're trying to do in meditation, is ultimately redirect yourself. Instead of all your attention always going outwards, you begin to bring it back within and begin to try to find the source of your being. And as I mentioned, you're trying to achieve a shift in consciousness. Go from the external physical consciousness, you bring it in to the inner mental consciousness, and eventually to the underlying spiritual consciousness, the real self, the true self that you are. You begin to find that presence there. And even the smallest bit of connection with that transforms your life. It completely begins to remove all fear, all anxiety, all sense of how can I handle this, how can I cope with this. Instead, there's confidence. There's a sense of there's this great power, this great wisdom, this great love is there within me, and it's behind me, it's supporting me, it's taking care of me. As this begins to grow, then you begin to find yourself completely satisfied. But as long as you're seeking your happiness outside in other people or other things, then you won't find it. So in meditation, like I said, what we're trying to do is to reverse our attention. From always being outside, we're trying to make it inside. And there's two basic paths of meditation that you find, actually 4 basic paths, you could say. the 4 basic yogas. There's Jnana Yoga, which is a path of knowledge. There's Bhakti Yoga, path of devotion. Raja Yoga, that's the path of meditation. And there is Karma Yoga, the path of action. Each one of these yogas is a method by which a person can move from his present state of human consciousness to that divine consciousness, become united. The word yoga means union, and it means it's a way by which a person can become united with God. Now, in the basic teachings about meditation are found in the Yoga Aphorisms of Patanjali. This is the basis of the Raja Yoga, the science of meditation, and it describes 8 steps by which a person can attain mastery over the mind. So in Raja Yoga, the focus is on using the mind, developing the mind to its full capacity in order to reach the goal. And in order to do that, Patanjali, he describes 8 steps, 5 preliminary steps and 3 stages of deepening concentration. But the basic idea in Raja Yoga is simply, instead of letting the mind wander all over the place, instead of it going every way, this way and that, you take one thing. You say, okay, this is the object of my meditation. This, for the time being, I'll just focus on this one thing. It may be a mantra, it may be a particular form of God, it may be a verse of scripture, whatever, but you say, for the time being, I'm only going to think about this one thing, and I'm not going to think about anything else. And as you do this, it's like I said, of almost of mental gymnastics, that as you do this, the mind gradually becomes stronger and stronger. Normally, the mind is in what they call the scattered condition, which means it's going all over the place. And we will notice if we watch our mind a little bit, that when we're trying to do something, say study something or read something or think about something, if you watch the mind, you'll see that for every thought you have about what you're trying to do, what you're trying to think about, there's 50 other thoughts come in that have nothing to do with it. And in this way, the mind is scattered. Now in Raja Yoga, you try to learn how to take the mind and learn how to concentrate it, how to focus it on one thing at a time. And the mind then becomes very powerful. As I've used example before, that whenever I talk with school kids, I always explain how if you go outside on a day like today, sun's coming down, you're getting warmth out of the sun, and it's nice gentle warmth is there. But then when you take a magnifying glass and you focus those same sun's rays, now it becomes so hot that you set something on fire, like a little leaf or a piece of paper or something. And most kids have done that at one time or another. Yeah, the same sun's rays, which before were just kind of gentle warmth, now are so hot that you can set something on fire. Well, the mind is the same way. In its normal scattered condition, it gets us through life. It got us through school, through college. It allows us to perform our job, to do our activities and things. It functions, and we get along. But if you can learn how to concentrate that same mind, develop its potential, then that same mind becomes extremely powerful. And this is the secret of success in practically anybody, whether they're a scientist or a artist or writer, the one who can focus on what his goal is, or focus on what he's trying to do, tends to achieve success, because that instrument of the mind is now functioning very well. And another thing that happens is that normally most of our problems, the problems we face in life, they come because of the mind. Because the mind is just running around and they don't know how to control it. Emotions come, desires come, feelings come, and they don't know how to control these things. And so many people, they're driven by the mind. They're driven by whatever feeling comes, whatever attitude comes, whatever experience comes. They're driven by the mind in order to and find their life more or less in chaos. Always doing things that they realize this isn't good, this isn't the right thing to do, but they are kind of helplessly driven by the impulses that come in the mind and often find themselves in all kinds of suffering and misery. But when you begin to actually control the mind, instead of just letting things happen in the mind, you start to determine what you want in the mind. You start to develop the ability to realize, okay, this particular stream of thought here, say something happens, you're upset about it, you're disturbed, you can stop and say, wait, do I need to be disturbed? Do I need to be upset about this? Do I need to be angry about this? And you can say no. And then you can kind of let that stream of thoughts go and put in something positive. Now, if a person has a regular practice, like say repeating a mantra or something, in time, that particular practice, that particular mantra, it becomes very easy to shift the mind from anything that's negative, anything that you don't want, to shift the mind and to put it into this groove, into this kind of spiritual groove. And slowly then the mind starts to come under your control. If the mind is under your control, if you have mastery of the mind, it's a wonderful instrument. It's one of the most helpful, kind of powerful instruments you have. But if it's not under control, then it can give you all kinds of problems. And the Gita says, the self is your best friend, but it's also your worst enemy. So many people live very miserable lives. And it's all because the mind is filled with all kinds of miserable thoughts and feelings and things, and they don't know how to control it. So as you begin to get control over the mind, then you begin to have the mind function the way it's meant to do, as an instrument which you're using for your purposes, not as something that's driving you, making you do things that you don't want to do. So in the Yoga Aphorisms, it mentions two basic methods by which you can get control over the mind. Or as they say, the thought waves, the vrittis, the thought waves in the mind. One is called abhyasa, practice, which means that you take one thing. You say, okay, I'm going to just think about this one thing for the time being, and I'm not going to think about anything else. And like that, steadily, slowly, you're getting the mind to a point where it'll settle down. It'll start to calm down, and you can then say, yes, I'm going to think about this, or I'm not going to think about that. And like that, it'll start to do what you want it to do. And so this abhyasa is continually putting in one particular thought and being able to hold that thought. Then the other aspect of learning how to control the mind is called viragya, or detachment. And this is also important because ultimately you're not the mind. As you said, ultimately you're spirit, you're Atman. And that Atman, that spirit, that eternal spirit which you are, it's the one who's trying to use this body and mind as its instrument to accomplish certain things, to get certain experiences. Now when through detachment, through viragya, detachment, it means you kind of stand back from the mind. You remind yourself, whatever's going on in the mind here, whatever feelings, whatever emotions, whatever desires are going on in the mind, that's not me. I'm here and I'm just watching it. And actually our real self, our true self, is called the sakshi, or the witness. It's the consciousness which is aware of what's going on. And so as you begin to get that perspective, then you see that the mind doesn't dominate you the way it did before. Before, if anger came, we say, I'm angry. And then it's very hard to control. We may not express it, but it's a struggle. It gets us very upset, and it's very difficult to control. But if you stand back and just kind of look at the anger scientifically, and say, okay, there's anger in the mind. Well, then you realize it's not you anymore. It's just there's something in the mind, and you watch it for a while, and you'll see it goes away. Something else comes into the mind. And like that emotion or desire, whatever comes in mind, it doesn't make you do things. It doesn't dominate you and overwhelm you. It now becomes just kind of an abstract thing. Okay, that's going on. And so two things happen as you begin to take this detached attitude towards your experiences. One is that the experiences, whether they're physical or whether they're mental, those experiences, they don't trouble you as much. They don't disturb you as much. They don't bother you the way they did before. The second thing, though, is that gradually you start to become aware of this other reality there. This other presence, this other source of joy, of inspiration, of peace and happiness, that gradually you become aware of that, and slowly you're making a shift from the mental activities. You're kind of standing back from that and then becoming aware of the underlying truth of who you are. And this then leads you into the Jnana Yoga, into the path of knowledge. Now, the basic principle in Jnana Yoga is that you are this witness, you are this spiritual consciousness, and that's your real nature, that's who you are. And so in Jnana Yoga, the goal is to become aware of that. One of the basic techniques, the classic technique is neti-neti, not this, not this. Whatever happens, whatever you experience, there's always two things. It may be a physical experience, something that happens outside, or it may be an inner mental experience. But in every experience, there's two things. There's the experience, the event itself, and there's the consciousness, which is the experiencer, which is aware of the experience. Normally the two are mixed up, so that if something happens, we say, well, this is happening to me. But in Jnana Yoga, they try to separate the two. Say, okay, this is happening to the body. And then realizing that I'm something different than the body. I'm something higher than the body. And then in that way, slowly a person gets back into the awareness of his real self. And as the scriptures tell us, the ancient scriptures, that our real self is actually Brahman, is actually the infinite source out of which the whole universe has come. The consciousness, the awareness which is within us, is actually that Brahman consciousness. But it's now become, because it's become identified with the body, that consciousness says, okay, I'm physical, I'm a body, I'm a very limited, small body. Or that consciousness is become identified with the mind. And that says, oh, I'm a happy person, or I'm a very unhappy person. But in truth, that consciousness, that awareness is something vaster than anything we can even conceive of. It's the source out of which all of creation has come. And that presence, that consciousness, is within each person. And so in Jnana Yoga, this is what a person tries to do, is to become aware of who I really am. As you study scriptures, things like that, you may become convinced, okay, I know I'm not the body. Body's here for a few years and it goes. I know that's not the real me, but then who am I? And like that, it begins a search, an inner search, until you begin to touch, discover, oh, there's this whole other dimension here. And so this is the path in Jnana Yoga. Now in Bhakti Yoga, there's also meditation. Often in Bhakti, the path of devotion, a person will have a particular aspect of God that is his Ishta, his chosen ideal, that he loves. He will be devoted to that particular aspect of God, and his meditation, his practice, may consist of repeating a mantra, the name of God, or it can also consist of thinking about the stories. Like you say, his Ishta, his chosen ideal is Rama. Well, he reads the Ramayana, and he thinks about all the episodes of the Ramayana, and slowly those episodes become more and more real for him, more and more part of his nature. And like that, he spends his time thinking about God, about the stories of God, and about the hymns of God, and prayers and so forth, and gradually becomes more and more absorbed. Now in Karma Yoga, which is a path of action. In this path, the person uses the realm of work, of action, but learns how to make it something spiritual. And normally work, our involvement in the world, it keeps us distracted from the spirit. It keeps us always involved in doing things and projects and things like that. And most people find they have no time for spirit, for spiritual practice or anything like that. So in Karma Yoga, you do your work, but you try to do it in such a way that it makes you spiritual. It helps you become more spiritual in consciousness rather than distracting you and taking you away from the spirit. Now, the traditional Karma Yoga is that you remind yourself that, okay, I'm not really the doer, that the body is performing the action. I'm separate from the process. I'm detached from the process. And in that way, and I'm also not concerned or not caught up with the results of the actions. Now, there's also an approach to Karma Yoga, to action based on devotion also, in that whatever I do, I'm doing it as an offering to God. I'm doing it as a worship. And this then slowly transforms ordinary work into something that's spiritual and that helps you evolve spiritually. Now, to understand Karma Yoga, you should realize that there can be two people working in the same office, have desks side by side, doing exactly the same job. For one person, it's just a job. He does the work, he gets paid, and that's it. Now, if the other person, he's doing the exact same work, he's getting the same amount of pay, everything's the same, but he's doing it with an attitude, okay, I'm offering this to God, or that I'm just an instrument in the hands of God. And like that, not only is he getting his pay like the other person, doing the job like the other person, but now he is developing a spiritual consciousness. So that not only does he get paid, but he's beginning to get inner joy, inner happiness. He's evolving spiritually as he does his work. And gradually that work, which may have been just very boring, just drudgery before, gradually that work, it becomes something wonderful, which fills the person with joy. Because it gradually, as a person does work with the right attitude, he begins to realize that it's something sacred. From the physical standpoint, because we're at the physical standpoint, we see things as just ordinary, everyday things, and that's it. But when we put the right attitude into work, into our activities, then it begins to unfold. And we begin to see a kind of a joy and a happiness and a beauty that was there, that's always been there, but we weren't aware of. And so the work, instead of being just a drudgery, a job that you have to do to make money, it now becomes a kind of a worship, a sacred practice. Once when I was in Houston, I was talking about this idea of Karma Yoga, and afterwards, this man came up to me, and he said he was a professor in college. And he said he used to hate teaching. He hated teaching, he hated the students, he was very miserable at it. But then he started trying to apply these principles of Karma Yoga. And he said now, whenever he had approached the classroom, he said he had the feeling like I'm entering a temple. And he was filled with just this inner joy, this inner love as he taught. And he was also connecting with the students now. They were really getting something out of his course and coming to him with their problems and things like that. So his whole work experience was transformed into something very wonderful and beautiful. In the same way, all of our experiences, every aspect of our life, it can be turned into something wonderful and beautiful and sacred if we're putting the right consciousness into it. This is the thing most people, we don't realize. He said the quality of our life, how happy we are, how much joy and satisfaction and so forth we get out of life, it doesn't depend on what we're doing. It doesn't depend on what specific job or what specific city we live in or anything else. It ultimately depends on the state of our consciousness. Yeah, as I mentioned before, most people think they can solve all their problems by changing something outside, by changing another person, another situation, get a better job, like that. But actually, it's the state of our consciousness, the state of our mind and consciousness that determines the quality of our life. Our happiness, our unhappiness, our inspiration, all these things come depending on what type of consciousness we put into things. So in spiritual life, the focus changes from trying to change the outside world and trying to change other people. It changes to trying to change yourself, changing your own inner consciousness, your own inner state of being. And as you do this, then you'll see that everything gradually becomes transformed, and eventually the very same life, which was just worldly before, which was just material, ordinary, everyday, kind of humdrum life, that very same life starts to unfold this tremendous beauty and divinity that's there within. Because it is always there, but simply we're not aware of it. It's like we put blinders on, and then we say, no, this is just material. This isn't spiritual. This is just ordinary things. But if we have the right consciousness, then it begins to become something of beauty, something of inspiration. So we can't control the world. We can't necessarily control other people or what's going on in our life or things like that. But we can control what we are inside. And this is where all of your spiritual practice and your meditation, where it focuses on. Instead of trying to always change everything outside, you begin to first of all work with what you are inside. Instead of letting all kinds of habitual kind of negative thoughts, fear, anxiety, things like this, instead of letting those come in, you start to replace it with sort of higher thoughts and better thoughts, and then you'll see that gradually that's what you become. That's what your nature becomes. And so through all of these different yogas, there are really, as I said, different techniques by which a person can go from his present state of consciousness, this ordinary, very limited state of human consciousness, and gradually unfold the infinite, divine consciousness that's there within. Swami Vivekananda, in one place, he said that to the bad person, to an evil person, this world is hell, because he sees evil all around, he sees bad all around. But for a good person, this very same world is heaven, because he sees a happy world, and so forth. But he said for the yogi, this very world becomes God himself. Even in our everyday, ordinary experiences, our ordinary job, they can become filled with wonder and beauty and inspiration as we begin to kind of attune ourselves to that higher consciousness. And so, in order to achieve this change of consciousness, this transformation of consciousness, it involves some form of meditation. Like I said, there can be many techniques, many different approaches, but ultimately, this is what you're trying to achieve, to move from your present state of consciousness, which is separate from God, which is not aware of God, which is not aware of Spirit, to move from that state of consciousness to this inner consciousness, where you become aware of God as an actual experience, as an actual presence within you, that gives you guidance, that looks after you, that takes care of you, that's with you as your companion. And then slowly you see your whole experience, the whole quality of what your life is, it becomes transformed into something very wonderful. And you'll find then that once you begin to find inner happiness, you have that happiness wherever you go. You can go to any city and be happy. You can meet anybody and be happy. You can go to any church and be happy. When you're depending upon the forms, upon a particular individual to behave a certain way, or your particular job to be a certain way, then you won't find it. But once you find your inner resources, your inner happiness, then wherever you are, it's all the same. You don't say, oh, I've got to get this better job in order to be happy. You just say, okay, if the better job comes, fine. If it doesn't, fine, because I've got happiness now. And so everybody can and should be happy all the time. But it's a question of what the state of our consciousness is, what our inner state of mind is. And this, in the beginning, usually involves work on our part to try to change the old habitual patterns of thought and feeling and things, to gradually transform them, to change them into something else. But as we work with that, we see slowly the change comes. You know, one person, David Hawkins, he mentioned how in the beginning, in spiritual practice, he said the spiritual practice is like a rocket leaving the ground. He said in the beginning, it takes tremendous power to get the rocket boosted, to get it up off the ground. But the higher it goes, the more less resistance there is from gravity, until finally it just sails along under its own power. In the same way, you'll find that in the beginning there's some struggle, some difficulty trying to change the patterns of your thought, trying to let go of old patterns and put in new patterns, but gradually it all becomes natural. And more natural, and then gradually become more aware of God's grace that's there. You know, Sri Ramakrishna has said that God is like a great magnet, and we're all like iron filings. Now, in the beginning, we are, the iron filings, they're covered with dirt and rust, and so they don't feel the pull of the magnet. And so our spiritual practice, our effort, is trying to clean the filings, to remove the dirt, and remove the rust and things from our mind. And then we see that naturally then comes the pull of the magnet. So the self-effort, the struggle, it comes in the earlier stages, but then you reach a point where things will just kind of take off. And you see yourself just kind of lifted higher and higher with no effort on your part. And so like that, there is this infinite, all-powerful, all-loving presence within each person. The smallest amount of contact, of connection with it, begins to completely transform our life. And it begins to completely remove all the misery, all the suffering. Because the suffering, the misery, the dissatisfaction that comes in life is entirely due to the state of our mind. A certain thing happens, and we say, oh, I didn't want that to happen, and then we get upset, we get angry, we get frustrated, and we're miserable. But now, if we didn't have that reaction, if a certain event happened, and we didn't react that way, and we said, okay, whatever, it wouldn't trouble us at all. We wouldn't be unhappy over it. We wouldn't be disturbed over it. It would just, goes on. So like that, as a person begins to get the slightest bit of contact with this inner resources within, then he finds that, oh, everything is fine now. And whatever happens, life just unfolds. Sometimes it unfolds what people may call good things, sometimes bad things, difficulties may come, but it doesn't trouble the person anymore, because he's not depending, not reacting to what those things that happen, because he's found something higher, something better. And so this capacity to kind of rise above the negative aspects of life and the unhappiness, to rise above that, and also to gradually become aware of the wonderful kind of things that are there within us, that capacity is usually gradually developed through meditation, through some process of, like I said, bringing our attention within and becoming gradually aware of what's inside. And so this is why meditation is so important. It's like at the core of spiritual life. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, religion and spirituality are two different things. Religion, a person can be religious, he can go to church, be a very good person, study scriptures, be devoted, all these things, and still be an ordinary human kind of state of consciousness. But the spiritual person, The spiritual life, it only comes as there's an unfoldment from within the person's own inner consciousness. As the kind of the darkness that covers our consciousness is removed, then gradually light begins to come in and we become transformed by that experience. You know, Joel Goldsmith, another kind of modern American mystic, he said the example, normally, most people, we're locked up inside of our body and mind. That's the only thing we know, the only world we know. And he said it was like a chicken, a little chicken inside its egg. The little chicken is sitting there in darkness. Just within the egg, and that's it, that's its whole world. It doesn't know anything else. But then gradually it starts to peck on the shell. And eventually it makes a crack, and eventually it breaks out of the shell. And then it discovers there's a whole vast world here. Well, he said most people, most human beings, were locked up inside of our personal self, our body, our mind, our individual kind of life. We're locked up inside there. We're not aware of anything else. We think this is all there is. But when we can learn to kind of break out of that shell, out of that limitation, then you see the infinity of that whole universe begins to unfold. You begin to become aware of it, so that your experience, your life is not just this very small, limited, personal life, but it now grows into something much, much bigger. You know, in London, Swami Vivekananda once, he was talking about evolution. That, you know, as Darwin, you know, he'd come out with a theory of evolution and all. So at one of his talks in London, Swami Vivekananda mentioned evolution, but he said evolution is actually spiritual. He said evolution is actually a evolution of consciousness. And the way he explained it, he said, suppose there was a screen between me and you, the audience. He said, I wouldn't be aware that you're there at all. I would just, just see the screen. Now he says, suppose you poke a little hole in the screen. Now I can look through and I can see, well, maybe one face. I can get a little glimpse. There's something there. And gradually, as that hole becomes bigger, you then begin to see more and more of the audience, until finally, if the screen's removed altogether, you see the whole audience clearly. But he said, the fact is that you never changed at all. It's only the kind of revelation, the removal of the screen that changed. You were the same. You were always the same. The audience was always the same. But your ability to experience that, it grew as you expanded. And he said this way, every soul is already divine. Every soul has the presence of God within, has that infinite consciousness within. But through evolution, spiritual evolution, we gradually expand our vision so that we see more and more of what's actually there. The whole universe begins to unfold before the person. So in this way, we can move from being very small, very little inside of our little tiny eggshell. Gradually, we can break out of that and begin then to become aware of this whole vast universe. For the chicken, little chicken, once he breaks out of the egg, he sees more in 5 minutes than he did in his whole previous existence. He discovers, oh, this whole vast barnyard here and everything else is all there. And so like that, individuals, we can live in a very limited physical consciousness, like I said, or we can expand a little bit into the mental level of learning and understanding and make our mind grow. You know, that's, when I was in the Army, I went to basic training in the Army. It was back in 60s, back in when Vietnam was going on. So as soon as you got out of college, you know, the Army was waiting for you. So I went from college, I went then to basic training, and for the first time, I was really living with people who were completely uneducated, you know, practically totally uneducated. And the thing, you know, I hadn't thought much about college or anything like that, but what I realized is that their existence was so small. All they knew really was what was happening to them. They didn't have any idea about literature and history and all these things. You know, it was just their small personal life was all they knew. at least in college, you had been exposed. Your mind had been exposed to much vaster ideas, and so you lived in a much bigger world. And in the same way, the person who's become spiritual, his consciousness has started to expand, to become one with that infinite consciousness, out of which all things have come. And so he lived in a much vaster existence than ordinary people, than we can even imagine. You know, Swami Vivekananda, Swami in San Francisco said that when you reach the spiritual level, he said it's vaster than anything that you can imagine. And those people who attain some progress, some awareness of the soul and so forth, they say that the joys and the pleasures and the happiness and success that comes out of the soul, out of the spirit, is beyond anything we can even imagine or dream of. You know, we think we have our personal ideas. Oh, this is what I need to be a better person, to be happier, or to get more. But even our greatest accomplishments in the world are nothing compared to what unfolds when a person begins to realize his own self. And Swami Vivekananda said, you know, everybody is potentially divine. Everybody has that divinity within themselves. It's a question of how much comes into our actual experience. This is the difference. And so that only happens through this process of meditation, of learning how to kind of let go of physical consciousness and always being absorbed only in what's going on outside, to gradually become aware of who we are inside and of what's going on inside, and gradually going deeper until we uncover the basis, the root of our existence, and then begin to realize that, oh, we're actually all children of God. We're all with God. We've always been with God. You know, this life that we're in, this world is like a movie. You go to the theater and you watch the movie. And maybe the movie is maybe a happy movie or maybe a very terrible movie. Now there's a lot of explosions and murders and all kinds of things going on. But you say, okay, it's a movie. But yet all the time, you're just seated in the theater. You're just seated in the theater and you're watching the movie. And that's why you enjoy it. If you actually were in the movie, like you're actually in a war, and not just watching a war movie, it'd be a terrible thing. But we forget that's actually what we are. As souls, we're mortal. We can never be hurt. We can never be harmed in any way. But we forget that. We forget, oh, I'm just watching this movie. I'm with God. Really, we forget that, and then we get totally caught up in the experience, and we suffer that by that experience when it goes bad, or we get happy when it goes good. But we're totally caught up in the experience and not remembering that, oh, actually everything is already fine. Everything I'm already with God. Everything I need, I have. But simply, you have to become aware of it. And so the reason we're not aware of it is so much of our attention has gone outside towards other things outside of that. We've forgotten who we are inside. And so in meditation, you're trying to kind of reverse that and become gradually aware of what's there, and then you unfold the vast, one mystic said, you go from glory to glory. You go from one wonderful thing to another wonderful thing without limit, because there simply is no limit to God or God's creation, and it's all there within each person. So this is the value, the purpose of meditation, is that unless we become somewhat aware of what we are inside, we simply won't be aware. We'll be like the chicken and its egg. We'll be just totally thinking this is all of reality. This little tiny world I'm in is all there is, and we won't know anything else. So this is, I said, Swami Vivekananda. He's been giving a series of talks on meditation, why we should meditate, his theory and practice. And so, since he's in Detroit this week, I took the class for him. And so, next Tuesday, he'll be back here. On Tuesday, he will do his class on the Panchama Veda, the Gospel of Sri Krishna. Then Friday, I do a class on the Katha Upanishad. I like that, and programs go on. So, thank you. Om Asatoma Satyamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Vidyurmam Amritam Galaya Om Shanti 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 O Lord, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light, and lead us from death to immortality. Oh, peace, peace,